de los éxitos. Pues,
Can everybody hear me? Let me welcome you all here. I'm sorry we didn't have a lunch for you, but we're particularly happy to host this event, co-host it with Brookings Institution. And of course, I want to welcome Felipe Larraín here. This is, like I said, you've been a long time away from the dialogue. In fact, I think it was, you were at the dialogue before your first appointment as minister.
That's right.
And anyway, you have a very warm welcome here. And let me just say that Felipe is one of the small elite in Latin America of people who are invited to serve as finance minister 2 times. And I won't tell you the record of those that have served 2 times. But I think that there was wide agreement that he really did a particularly splendid job during his first period. It was a period of very rapid growth for Chile. And I think, if I recall, you were named Finance Minister of the Year, maybe in your first years as that the
2010.
Yeah, and in any event, let me just. I was going to say, besides being a very effective finance minister, Felipe is also a good economist.
Thank you.
They don't always go together. I want to just mention that. I gather you've written or edited some 14 books, which is a lot more than I've read. And you've advised more governments in Latin America than countries I've traveled to in the region. So, but let me not keep going on, because it's easy to keep going on about Felipe, and just also welcome Ernesto Talvi, who, besides being co-host here, is also a very good economist, and representing Brookings, and he heads a research center in Uruguay, and directs the project, the Uruguay Center with the Brookings Institution. And what we're going to do today is ask Felipe some questions, and he's going to answer them, his usual frankness and openness. And I'm going to start off, and then once we get into it, we're going to open it up to the audience. So get your questions ready, because. But let me just start off with one question. You know, Chile is sort of looked as now, after 25 years of democratic government, more the country of no surprises. Whenever you sort of ask people, Sebastián Piñera is going to replace Michelle Bachelet, what's going to happen new in Chile? People say, things are going to progress pretty much as they were before. Not going to be many changes. It's not like the jumps that some of your neighbors have from a Kirchner to a Macri. But in any event, so let me ask you this. What surprises should we expect from the Piñera administration? What really is going to be new on your agenda that hasn't been done or has been done badly before? What is it that you'd like to accomplish that's surprising? We all know you want more growth, want greater equality, but what should we look for as the big surprise?
Well, first of all, thank you, Peter. Thank you, Ernesto. It's a pleasure to be here at the Dialogue, and also this event co-hosted by the Dialogue and Brookings, and be among friends here and colleagues. I am an academic who is serving in politics,
right,
rather than a politician who's trying to see what he does when he's out of government, which are there 2 ways, So in that sense, but I would also say that I would quote my friend Alejandro Foxley, who you know well, and Alejandro defines this brand of academics that go to government as technopoles. So we cannot pretend to be technical. We're politicians. We're also politicians. So it's a mix. It's a brand, technopole. Right. And just as an anecdote, you were mentioning that this is second. I'm part of this group, which very small group of guys who does it twice. Well, my children, when I told them, and they asked me, "Dad, do you really want to do it again?" So I'm not sure, but I'm enthusiastic about this. This is a very challenging job, and it's a very exciting job, but it's a very demanding as well. Let me say, I think Chile has had a continuity. And I feel that during the first government of President Piñera, where I also served as finance minister, I think there was more continuity because we never had as a platform in that campaign, to replace what was done before. We regarded that, and we shared a lot of things with the Concertación government. We had our differences, but we shared a lot of things with the Concertación. And we value many things that were done during the Concertación. It is a different thing what happens with the Nueva Mayoría. The Nueva Mayoría is a break in Chile. It's a new coalition. It's a new coalition that apparently is defunct. It's a coalition that served for 4 years, but now it's called the Force or the Fuerza de Mayoría or something else. But the Nueva Mayoría, the previous government, did a lot of things, and the image of the Nueva Mayoría was the retroexcavadora. This bulldozer, basically, that was going in the words of a senator of the coalition, was going to destroy the basis of the neoliberal model or something, of the economic model, which in the end, it was not done. But we have many differences, which what was done, not with the Concertación, but yes, with the Nueva Mayoría. And the first thing is, in terms of growth, there is a difference because, and I would say in the realm of the economic policy, first of all, the fact that Chile went to grow from 5.3% to 1.7%, the 3.6 percentage point drop cannot be explained at any rate by the end of the super cycle, the commodity super cycle. There is a part of the explanation there, but on our view, and I take IMF research, the biggest part of the slowdown came internally. Was done through lack of confidence, the loss of confidence, the increase in uncertainty, and through economic policies that were not what we used to have. I think there was a loss in the quality of economic and in general public policy making during the previous government that we didn't see in the Concertación government. During the Concertación period, we may agree or not, but bills sent to Congress were well crafted, and that was a change, in it. So I think what we have said is we want to regain the ability to grow fast. And what is our goal? Going from 1.7% growth to 3.5% to 4%. We cannot. We don't want to overbuild expectations in the sense of saying, okay, we want to go back to go at 5. Or some people say to me, but you're not too ambitious. Well, growing at 3.5 to 4 makes a difference in many respects. First, it's more than doubling the rate of growth where we're coming from the next 4 years. And what would be the ways in which this will be done? First, there are 2 ways which are already happening, which is we're seeing the economy picking up, but I don't believe that based on 1 or 2 months of growth, you can just claim victory. No, this is a long-term battle. First, regaining confidence, and we are seeing all the surveys of business and consumer confidence to improve significantly, particularly after the second round of the election. So we have that. The second is reducing policy uncertainty, and I think if you are in a project, you're trying to accomplish your business goals or whatever, you want to hire people, it's enough with market uncertainty, and doing away with policy uncertainty is an important issue. I think the third fact is the better management of the resources of the state. The fourth is the I would say it's policies, it's trying to improve in policy making. And the fifth is trying to rebuild and, as I would say, to strengthen the institutions. Because one thing is policies and institutions is a longer thing. Based on those 5 issues, and one of them, how do you rebuild institutions, we have the reform of the state as a very important issue. Reform of the state meaning that to have a digital government, to have a government, to improve on government procurement. There are many, many ways in which we want to do. I don't think we're not trying to say that we have a revolution in the making. We just want to have, growth that is inclusive. With growth, if you double growth, you're going to have more employment, but more importantly, you are going to have a better employment. Better jobs. And better jobs, I mean jobs with a contract, with Social Security. What we have seen is not only a decline. Over the last 4 years, there has been a significant decline in the number of jobs. But it's not only the number of jobs, but the composition of those jobs. We have a lot of self-employment, a lot of street vendors, and those people are basically informal. So I think improving the quality of job is also important, not just the number of jobs. That is one area, which is the area of growth, inclusion, employment, etc. And the second part is we have had this is not just an opinion, it's the facts tell you that there's been a deterioration in public finances in Chile. We still have a relatively low level of public debt internationally. 24% of GDP is a relatively low level. We are here in a country that has 100% of GDP, But you are the U.S., we have not convinced yet the rest of the world to use Chilean pesos, to have their currency, their reserves. So, I mean, if that would be done, we may be able to run a larger deficit and finance
28%.
Huh? 28. So, but the issue is that the level of debt was doubled over the last 4 years. And this pace, it is not the level, it is the pace of increasing the debt. That we have to, this is not, as I said, this is not an opinion, the numbers are there. Last year, what happened was that in 2017, we had a downgrade on the risk. For the first time in a quarter of a century, Chile received a downgrade from both Standard & Poor's and from Fitch. And we have said as part of our program, that part of the objective, that over a 3 to 4 year period, we would like to take back the notch that we lost. We don't want to do this because we have because we want to look well in the international seminars, but because this is the way that Chile can get resources on better terms for the state, for public enterprises, private enterprises, and ultimately to Chileans, because in the end, if you reduce your risk ratings, you're going to have worse terms in terms of getting resources and getting loans and credits, and this will spread through the economy. So I would say those are the 2 main objectives, at least on the part that I have to deal with, which is the economy, in terms of growth, inclusive growth, and with the important social component, we have made a big effort there, and we're already starting to see some of the first bills going to Congress in terms of, increasing resources for for primary education and for infants, and and also to technical education, which is another part, not just giving resources to public education. So I would say those are the main issues. You probably won't find we have a lot of things, but maybe what is a surprise, I think that's what, and these are the main things that we said during the campaign.
Thank you. Ernesto, I'm going to turn it over to you. He's going to be the bad cop. I'm going to still be the good cop. But let me ask one question, add on to that, is that it sounds to me like you're suggesting a high degree of continuity but doing it better and more sort of directed and coherent management of where Chile might be headed. And just wonder, the administration, the previous administration of Michelle Bachelet, tried to do a lot of things. They had a very ambitious agenda, from pensions, education, labor, constitutional. I mean, it goes on, but what are the 2 or 3 things that you might see yourself carrying on in the next period, and which are you going to sort of push aside? Is there a sense of...
Well, we understand, and first of all, let me say, I would fully give the benefit of the doubt in terms of, that of course, I think the objectives and what they try to do for the better of the Chilean people. But we cannot judge intentions in politics. We have to judge results, and the results were very poor, So we saw an economy that really scaled down significantly. There was what I would say, it was not a smooth, deceleration, but rather more of a hard landing. If you go from growth of 5.3 to 1.7, that's not a smooth deceleration. So I think part of the issues that were made, let's take, one thing that all the way we criticized, and we gave, not only criticized, but gave our options for it, was tax reform. Well, tax reform was done to increase by 3 percentage points of GDP, the revenue for the government, and to finance education, and to finance higher education, and also to reduce the structural deficit, which is the way we carry policy in Chile, is according to, not to the current deficit, but to the structural deficit. Well, but it happened that this tax reform made for such a complex scheme in Chile that it's not we who say this. The School of Accountants in Chile, when we were going into government, made a public statement saying that please postpone the deadline for the filing of taxes in Chile, because this is so complex that we cannot cope with it. And they have no political affiliation. They're not a government or an opposition group. This is just the School of Accountants. And I have seen myself, by going with the head of the IRS, our local IRS, to go to different places where they're trying to help the people. The people are really trying to comply, but there is a big hurdle in terms of the complexity of the tax system. We need to simplify significantly the tax scheme. And we will propose our own measures. Simplify, give legal certainty to people. And because the law was poorly crafted and was vague in many issues, what happened in the end was that you get the IRS to have to give the opinion. The IRS should be implementing policy. It shouldn't be trying to, interpret the law, because it's not their role, And when you have a problem with the law, then that's what happens. So I think simplifying, giving legal certainty, this has been so much a problem, so big a problem. I met with the head of the Small Business Association of Chile. There are 1 million small businesses in Chile. And this guy said that it's, for them, this tax reform is a nightmare. That please help us, And the big companies can hire, advisors, accountants, lawyers, tax lawyers. Small companies have nowhere to go. So I think this is one area where we have a difference. There are things, of course, where there is continuity. Let me give you an example. The previous administration, I give you 2 examples of continuity. TPP, the previous administration signed TPP without the U.S. This is an area where we will continue working. I just met with Secretary Steve Mnuchin, and I said to him, which he visited Santiago, we would welcome the U.S. back, into TPP, well, provided that, that on reasonable terms, of course. But so TPP is an area, and the way we approach our how we insert ourselves in the global economy. And also, there is a bill that was passed during the previous administration on the export of services that we're going to deepen the export of services, because we need to change a bit the structure of the Chilean economy, if we can, by diversifying our export base. So, and the idea of exporting even financial services is going to be an area where we will be working. And this establishes also a level of continuity. So we disagree on tax reform. We have agreements in other areas. There is continuity, there is change. We didn't come with a bulldozer, you know. We want to bury the bulldozer, you know, la retroexcavadora. So that is basically.
Ernesto?
Thank you. Thank you, Peter.
Now test him as an economist.
We run out of auditoriums at Brookings, so the dialogue acted as the lender of last resort. And thank you for hosting us here, and it's a pleasure to organize it jointly. A great pleasure to have Felipe. We've known each other for many, many years and interacted in many settings. Felipe, this is extremely interesting how you started out your conversation. And let me see if I can. Mauricio Macri won in Argentina with the claim that we want to become a normal country once again. It would be very difficult for a Uruguayan to think that you can win on a platform that says we want to become a normal country. We are a normal country. So this is a very subtle difference, but qualitatively, when you say there was, during the Nueva Mayoría, not the Concertación, there were loss of confidence, uncertainty, public policies that were sloppily crafted, and a desire to do away with the basic tenets of the model that prevailed in Chile for so many years, then your agenda somehow starts to sound like we want to become a normal country once again. I'm exaggerating just to make the point. Is Chile also running the risk of being polarized by the possibility of alternating governments that have very, very different conceptions on how to organize social and economic life?
Yes, well, first let me say I think we are a normal country. So we are, basically we have our differences, but we are basically, I think the Chilean economy, if you look at the country, I think Chile is a country with very solid institutions. That, I'm not claiming that the institutions have been destroyed. When you mentioned the idea of the previous administration to change, it is not I or our, coalition who said that. It was their coalition who said that. The sentence, was basically was given by a very prominent senator. It's not that we're saying that, but I think that in terms of the you say this polarization. When we came into government, we're trying to to get back to national agreements, and we have started doing groups, forming groups and commissions that will be a national agreement for infancy, to work with infants, as a priority, a national agreement for security. There will be a national agreement for health, and there will be a national agreement also for economic development, economic and social development. So we would like to get not to the polarization, we would like to get some consensus, and I know that we will disagree on several issues, but there are other issues where we can agree. And I will tell you that not only we're getting in these national alliances and commissions on each of the themes, not only we're getting some members of the previous, who supported the previous government, but people who were to the left, from the Frente Amplio in Chile. If you follow Chile, that you have a group, that is to the left of the previous coalition, and they are participating in these commissions as well. So we hope to build some basis of a consensus, and there is one thing, if you go back all the way to 1990 in Chile, to the time of President Elwin, I tremendously value what was done, in terms of generating broad consensus on economic reforms. I think those broad consensus, if we can get back to that, to this concept of getting broad consensus, and not just saying, okay, now I have a majority. We lack a majority, by the way. We lack a majority in both chambers, so that makes life a little more complicated. I would love to be a finance minister with a majority in both chambers. I would sleep much better. I would sleep more, But we don't have that luxury. I think getting this broad consensus is important. Even if we had a majority, I would try to get a broader consensus, not just from the ruling coalition, to make changes. Because I think it's important for the continuity of those changes. But having said that, when you say this alternation, we hope, if we do well, that we will be succeeded by someone from the same coalition. And this is of course, the objective, I mean, not the objective, but the hope of any government, to be succeeded by someone of your coalition. If you do well, that the Chilean people will reward you with another term.
So,
You have another good question? You have another good question?
I have many questions, but I don't want to.
Well, no, I just to pick up on one thing you said, and then you'll have another question, and maybe then we can open it up. A lot of talk about trade wars now and disruptions, and how concerned are you about the economic international policies of the U.S. and their impact on China, and just roiling one. And secondly does Chile really want the United States back in the TPP at this point? Won't it be a disruptive to bring it back so soon after it? Why not wait a couple of years and sort of say, look, let's get this thing going and then come back. We'll be on firmer ground rather than open up the TPP again to another round of disruption and discontinuity.
Well, on the first thing, we're certainly concerned about the possibility of a full-fledged trade war, although I would say that the probability of this happening has receded over the last 2 weeks, over the last 10 days. After President Xi opened up, it's not a huge thing, it opened up the auto, reduced duties on autos, and also another issue that has been pointed out by the U.S. government, and I think on this issue they have certainly a point that, they talk about this bilateral, the U.S. talks about this bilateral deficit, the bilateral trade deficit. Okay, but you don't manage trade on a bilateral basis, but of course with China, there are hundreds of billions of dollars of this deficit. But they say, okay, we have a very open economy with very, very low tariffs, close to zero, and then on China, we have to face very stiff tariffs. So it's a way to reduce tariffs, but it's not only that, because if you can enter the Chinese economy, if you cannot enter through trade, the typical thing is that you go and invest in China. But if you invest, then the company has to be 51% Chinese. And so they say, so what the government says, and this is what Secretary Mnuchin says, well, so we have the deficit, and we say, well, let's go invest there, but then we transfer technology, and then we lose the technology, to our competitors. So we give them the technology. So there has been also some change in the second issue. That's what the governor of the Central Bank of China announced, that there will be a revision to the idea of majority ownership of the Chinese, in these joint ventures. So that's the good part. If you have, well, the bad part is that when you start the trade escalation, you don't know where you will end. You start and you raise tariffs, and then you got a retaliation. And then you may get other countries involved, and we hope it doesn't happen. We have, I would say, 3 main effects. If we believe that we can, sort of sit in the sidelines and watch the problem, we are part of the issue. We are part because, first of all, a trade war means a reduction in trade and a reduction in growth. And we are heavily involved in the world economy. Second, there will be an effect in commodity prices, and we are very dependent on one commodity, which is copper. So copper will be affected by a trade war. And third, there's the increased volatility of the financial markets. You have the VIX and the different measures of stock market volatility and other kinds of financial volatility increasing during a trade war. So it's a very bad problem for all of us. So we cannot take just the view Some people take a very short view and say, okay, maybe I get a benefit because Chile has a free trade agreement with 64 countries. So we're in a very unique position. We can defend ourselves better towards protectionism because we have this network of FTAs. But in the end, that is only a partial view because I think the overall, we will be damaged by the fact that there is a trade war. On TPP, I would say, I talked about this precisely this morning with the Secretary Mnuchin, and he said, well, at this stage, and I fully understand, we have other priorities. We have China, and I understand China is a larger priority than TPP for them, for the US. Second, we have NAFTA. So they're renegotiating NAFTA. They are in the issue with China, so they will pursue these things before TPP. But I would say that if, on reasonable terms, that TPP will gain by having the US, and the US will gain by being part of TPP, on reasonable terms. And this won't happen. So you're probably that maybe this will happen in a year or maybe more. No?
Let me get back to Chile, Felipe. I was going to ask you about your concerns about the possibility that interest rates rise faster and in a steeper way than anticipated. But, I mean, let me ask, are there any concerns in the sense that Chile, although Chile's public sector has very low levels of debt, the private sector is very highly leveraged, with a pretty large pile of external debt and dollar-denominated debt. Do you have any concerns about the possibility of sudden stops or sudden seizures in international liquidity?
Well, definitely, we're looking at that, and that's one reason that we are doing a fiscal adjustment in Chile. We have already made an austerity package in Chile, which is a signal because we will do more, but we said, okay, we're going to stop many trips. If you have to make a trip, you have to buy your ticket, with at least a week in advance, because otherwise you'll pay double for. So I mean, saving here and there, the usage of automobiles and cars changing a car after 8 years. We have said you have to use 8 years a car. And some people say, well, this is punishment, punishment. But one of my colleagues said, my car has 200,000 kilometers. And I said, you have to drive another 100,000, And the car may last longer than you, because, that's something that can happen in public service, that you're fired before, and your car continues, So,
that's
what I'm saying.
Very institutional.
Institutional, yes, of course. So I think we are concerned about the issue. And that's why we said that we cannot keep the pace of growth of the debt. Although our level of debt is one of the lowest in Latin America, it's very close to Peru, their gross debt, 24. At the very bottom, and Brazil is over 78, on the high end. One way of protecting yourself from a scenario of higher interest rates if by putting brakes on the deficit and on the increase in the level of public debt. So that is one thing. But on the issue of private debt, we are looking at that very closely. We have an institution called the Consejo de Estabilidad Financiera, the Financial Stability Council, which is headed by the finance minister, but where you have the central bank president, the superintendents of, the head of the Committee of Financial Markets, the former superintendency of Valores y Seguros, and the bank superintendent, and the pension superintendent. All these people, we have an analysis of this issue of debt, and we are prepared to take macroprudential measures, so that, not capital controls, but macroprudential measures to, if we see that the level of debt is too high. Let me just give an example of a macroprudential measure. Loan to value, in the banking sector. Let's say loan to value not over, you don't lend over 80%. But we don't put a cap, but we say, okay, if you are going to lend over 80% of the value of a property, let's say a mortgage loan, If you're going to lend more than 80%, then the provisions are much higher. So there is a disincentive built in through the provision mechanism to take too much debt, and to try to avoid a housing or a real estate boom that in the end, financed with loans, could create an environment of more vulnerability for Chile.
I think we can, unless you have something more, Ernesto.
Go ahead.
We can open it up. Oh, I think I see some hands. We'll take 2 or 3 questions.
Sure.
And then
Sure.
Sergio, here's someone from Frente Amplia. And
No. Sergio is not from Frente Amplio. Is it someone from Frente Amplio?
Oh, so you are not from the UDI.
No.
Clear. Well, I'm pleased to be with my friend Felipe here, and I think that the country is living a very interesting time of agreements and continuity. One can emphasize for the campaign the differences, but on education, the President Piñera has stated that he will continue with free education, as was pushed, and now he's moving a little bit again for the technical education. You can find several areas where the attempt to build some understanding are possible, and I think that's good for the country. Now, my question would be, what kind of agreements you want to push in your area? And in order to achieve that, let me make a friendly suggestion. The senator that expressed the idea of the retroexcavadora is one guy. It's not the government. Myself, and I don't think that the senator to whom you refer could be better than myself as a senator at the same time. I've been rejected that, and our parties have rejected that. So one suggestion is don't take those issues because they don't represent what the previous government was, and you will create tensions. Second suggestion, the rate of growth during the last quarters of the Piñera government were very low in terms of the average. The rate of growth of the last quarters of Bachelet are higher than the average. So something had to do with the price of copper. So of course, we have had the discussion in Chile, but I would say that is a friendly suggestion to facilitate any agreement because you don't have majority in none of neither the House nor the Senate. The third thing is la concertación. Well, we are friends from that period of time. You were the most open people from the opposition at the time. I remember that. But the right was opposed to almost everything we did as concertación. We pushed a series of reforms. And so now it's easy to say, well, we support the concertación, but at the time that things happened was not the case. So my suggestion is that, and my question is, if you move in that direction, I think it would be easier for you and for the country, because I believe that we should agree on some issues. Now, are you planning to start with the reduction of the tax of companies? That's what you have stated. Or can you accompany that with other things? The simplification, I agree with the simplification of the tax. But what other things could be achieved in your area?
Thank you. Let's take 1 or 2 questions. Suggestions over here. Questions.
Let me have an exception.
I am. I give it to you. Richard, this is a question, right?
I have a number of suggestions. Richard Newfarm with the International Press Center.
Economist.
Felipe, you mentioned the term inclusive growth, which of course is really important in Chile. And Chile, like the United States, confronts a very skewed distribution of income. Part of that comes from the structure of the economy, minimal-based economies and the like. You mentioned services exports, which also have wide variation in productivity across activities and sectors, and leading to skill bias in the generation of growth. What kinds of policies would your government consider to sort of offset those very strong headwinds that lead to even more concentrated distributions of income?
Why don't we take these two? They're
Sure.
tough questions, and don't want to forget them.
Sure. Well, first of all, let me say that I value the suggestions, Sergio. So I will take them at heart, you know. And yes, we want to be. Look, there is a very delicate equilibrium here because you want to say what differentiates this government from the previous one. At the same time, I try to say that there are areas where we see continuity. So, in terms of the policies where, you know, your question of where can we find ground. First thing is on tax. I think simplification will get an agreement, and I know that some people have been opposed to the idea of lowering the corporate tax rate. We're talking here, let me just say, this country just underwent a tax reform that reduced the corporate tax rate from 39 to 21% here in the US. Well, you can say 35 to 21 or 39, depending on, yeah, but it's a huge, and we have to live in that world, and we have to understand that there is tax competition in the world, that we are in a world that we want to attract capital. If you look what happened in every country over the last, let's say, 4 or 5 years, or even more, 7 years, you see a reduction in the corporate tax rate. The direction has been unmistakable. Every country understands that we are trying to. So I don't want to distinguish Chile, you know, and I wouldn't like to distinguish Chile to having the lowest tax rate. But we are above the level. Why did we say reducing from 27 to 25? Because 25 happens to be the average level of the OECD. So we say, okay, you know, that's a reasonable level. If we are competing, if we have had, let me just say, 4 years in a row of reduction of investment. Investment has declined for 4 consecutive years. These are figures. These are facts. You know, we need to get back. We need to do something on tax. But let me say, on this, our commitment is first, we're not going to raise VAT to compensate. And we are going to have a revenue neutral reform. We haven't spelled it out in detail, but we will have a revenue neutral. So we will not say, okay, you know, we're going to just lower taxes and expect growth to pay for that. No, we're not going to say that. We understand that we cannot lower revenues because precisely of the way the situation is. So that is one area. The other area, I think, in the modernization of the state, I think there are areas where we can find common ground. We will send several projects, several bills to Congress to, for example, to deepen fiscal institutions. You know, and we expect to get, you know, a broad-based agreement on those. So and on the final point, I cannot stop but pointing to the detail of that. When Sergio says that during the last quarters of the Piñera administration, where the growth declined, and the last quarters of the Bachelet administration, growth improved. Well, that is correct, you know, except for one fact, that they are, and we are not saying it's just purely domestic or national issues or purely external. What I'm going to try to explain, and very briefly, is the balance between the two. Where do you draw the line? There is an IMF paper, you know, in fact, is the World Economic Outlook a year and a half ago, that said if you're a commodity exporter, you should expect, depending on what you are exporting. If you're non-oil exporter, but you're natural resource economy, like Chile's non-oil, natural resource, you should have a decline in your growth of 1 percentage point. That could be attributed to the end of the of the commodity supercycle. If you are an oil producer where the shock was much larger, then you can have a little over 2 percentage points of decline in growth. Well, that helps us to understand. If Chile had a 3.5%, 3.6 percentage point decline in growth, then 1 point could be attributed to external factors. The other 2.5 must come internally. So that's why I would say on my assessment, it's 2/3, 1/3. So what happened externally is important, but it's the majority of the issue comes internally. On the deceleration issue, yes, and Sergio, you know, this was a discussion in our country, that the Nueva Mayoría presented the program, you know, in June 2013. June. I do remember that because I said, and I was heavily criticized at the moment, because I said that that program, the economic aspects of the program, will have a very significant detrimental effect on investment and growth. And you saw from the third quarter, the effect of 2013, the effect was relatively small. In the fourth quarter, investment, you had, because investment reacts before then. Consumption was not so much affected. It was really investment that declined. So part of the effect came from the international economy, and an important part of the effect came from the expectations and the readings that the people who were investing made of the economic program. In the last 2 quarters of the previous government, during the second Bachelet period, so we're talking about 2017, particularly third and fourth quarter of 2017, the pickup started pretty much in the fourth quarter. Yes, during the previous government, because of 2 reasons. Because we had better, I wouldn't say hugely better, but yes, better international conditions started to play a role. But also the fact that the markets understood that the candidate that was running ahead, had a very different attitude towards growth and tried to stimulate growth. And we saw that in business sentiments, in all these expectational surveys. And this happened, in December after the second round. Business sentiment, consumer sentiment did not increase smoothly, jumped. So I think, in the end of the period of a government, you start to play with the expectations, which are so important, particularly for investment. So that would be my way of explaining that. Richard, on the issue of income distribution, we have, Latin America is probably the region with the highest income inequality in the world. It's a tight race with sub-Saharan Africa. We are not the poorest, but we are the most unequal. In that, region, Chile is pretty much in the average of inequality. It's not to say that we are happy to be on the average. We're not the most extremely unequal. We're not the most. Probably Uruguay is the country with the lowest inequality in Latin America. So that's one observation. The second observation is that we have had an improvement in income inequality. Small improvement. Our Gini is now, went from, at the beginning, the improvement started in 2000, in Chile. And you see the Gini probably was at the peak close to 0.54, and now we are at 0.48, 49. So, I'm not saying it's a huge improvement, but we are seeing some improvement in income inequality. Question is, how do we continue this path? A case for optimism is that if you look at income inequality by cohorts, you will see that among elder people, income inequality is much higher than among younger people. So the spread of education to people is not the gratuity, la gratuidad, is the fact the access to education has implied that the younger generations have much less income inequality. I think we need to continue on that path. And Sergio is right that, we have an agreement with a caveat, in terms of extending free education, free higher education for the technical, because in the technical education has been left, pretty much aside. And this is where the most vulnerable people is. And in this particular digital economy, robotics, and so on, technical education becomes so important. So I think in education, getting there is an important issue. We don't believe that we're going to accomplish by further increases in taxes will be the way to improve income distribution. It's just education and probably training as well, training programs that we need to improve significantly, particularly for small businesses which are not using the government help in terms of training programs.
we're getting close to the hour, but can you take a couple of more questions? Yeah.
Sure.
Please, tell us who you are. I forgot to ask that of others, so.
I'm Gabrielle Treybot. I'm a director for Latin America at McClarty Associates. Mr. Minister, you've mentioned, and we've heard President Piñera mention a number of the important reforms that are on the agenda for the government: tax reform, pension reform, ISOPRES reform. Could you share a little bit the thinking in terms of, I mean, all are very politically difficult and will take some time, I would imagine, how you are thinking about sequencing those reforms at all, if possible, and what you think would be the process would be for incorporating stakeholder industry, investor input specifically?
Let me take one more and then
Sure.
I'll let you. Sebastian, did you want to? Yes. Okay, another Uruguayan, by the way, so.
Thank you.
Or half Uruguayan, I'm sorry.
Uruguayan, half Argentinian.
Oh, that's a terrible.
My good side is Uruguayan, so
He's hedging.
Oh my God.
I'll try to make this brief. The rest of Latin America, chronically in fiscal deficits, has always looked up to the Chilean fiscal rule, but usually the inside view is much more self-aware and critical than the outside one. So I was wondering whether you could very briefly assess the effectiveness and success of Chile's fiscal rule, and perhaps draw some lessons for the rest of us mortals in terms of mechanism design. Thank you.
Normality isn't in fashion these days, really.
Well, let me take the first question in terms of the sequencing of reforms. First of all, we're happy to listen to the views of the industry. We will listen to the views of the industry. We will talk to them. We will talk to labor. We'll talk to entrepreneurs. We'll talk to stakeholders. And considering those views, we will send our bill, at the end to Congress. Take pension reform. We all agree in Chile that we need better pensions. And this is behind the bill that was sent by President Bachelet, and is behind the project that was presented. The idea was presented by President Piñera, and it's part of our program. The issue here, there is a contentious issue, not so much in terms of the increasing Social Security contributions. We pretty much agree that on Social Security contributions, we need to increase between 4 and 5 points. We say 4, the other bill says 5, but that's the main difference. Is not but 1 point. We all agree also that it has to be gradual, that we cannot hit the labor market in 1 year with 4 points or 5 points. So we will do it gradually. Then we stop on the agreements, because the way to organize this, well, the previous administration wanted to have what it called a collective saving council, Consejo de Ahorro Colectivo, to manage part of the increased contributions. So let me just point to I understand that they have their own explanation for doing that. I don't, we don't, it's not that but, we don't believe in the collective council managing so wisely the funds. We believe that we need to improve competition and increase competition in the administration of funds. And we have said, as an idea, that we would consider having the cajas de compensación, which are not for profit, also, competing in the management of savings of pension savings. There are many ideas to increase competition. So that is one area. The other thing is, where do you get the resources? Because you have two basic problems here. Let me just spell them out. One is to increase the contributions to your own saving account. That's mainly middle class people who have their own savings, and they say, okay, clearly the problem comes, and this is a worldwide problem, not just a Chile problem. The good news is that people are living longer. The bad news is that you don't have enough money when you get to retirement, and retirement ages are fixed. So we're saying, are fixed in Chile, 65 years for men, 60 for women. And a woman in Chile at age 60 has a life expectancy of almost 90. Almost it's 89 at 60, not at birth. how do you finance 30 years of, that is a big issue. And so we are thinking, as another thing, which may be, part of an agreement, to give incentives to people who get close to retirement age to keep working voluntarily. Not increase the legal retirement age, but give incentives to people. Let's say you keep working and you have to contribute additionally, the state will contribute something to your account. This will be differentiated more for women than for men. We want to give, because the problem of the big gap between the pension and the income is more for women than for men, because men live less. We live less, And second, because retirement age is one at 60 and the other at 65. People are starting to understand this and they want to continue working. We also need the cooperation of companies in Chile. Companies and institutions who employ, not to make it mandatory to retire for people when they reach retirement age. The big disagreement, as I say, is, I think in that thing we won't have a big disagreement. The disagreement will come on how you finance the pensions, or the better pensions for the lower end, people who are the most vulnerable part of the society. What we call the pensión básica solidaria in Chile, the minimum pension, or the pensión con aporte previsional solidario, the pension that gets support from the government. The project sent by the previous government says that this should be financed out of the Social Security contributions of people who are active, the active workers. And we say that's not a good idea because that would penalize employment. So we think that whatever comes as increased contributions should go to individual accounts, and the state should increase out of general revenues the lower end of the pensions. So the people who are poor, who did not contribute in their life and get the minimum pension, should get it from general revenue of the state. I think that would be the disagreement. And it's a complicated thing. We will try to get an agreement. We don't know if we will reach an agreement. We will anyway, during this year, we'll send the bill to Congress. The other issue here on the fiscal rule, I think the fiscal rule is one of the good things that has happened in Chile, and it's, it happened in 2001, and we have had continuity over the rule. Some people treat better the rule, and some others, treat badly the rule. We believe that rather than having illuminated people treating, or kind ministers treating the rule well, what we should do is improve the institutionality around the rule. And we have many things that we will be doing during our government, sending bills to Congress to make institutions, fiscal institutions, so deepen the rule rather than, I'm seeing also other countries in the region adapting fiscal rules. Fiscal rule, not just, there are some rules, we say, I have a fiscal rule. Well, tell me which is your rule, because there are terrible rules too. A rule, for example, that says, I run a balanced budget. That's a terrible rule. That was, by the way, Graham Randman Hollings in this country. Run a balanced budget is pro-cyclical. You should have a counter-cyclical rule. If you run a balanced budget, when things are good, you spend more because you have more resources. And when you have the bad times, you spend less and you have to cut spending because you don't have enough resources. So terrible rule. What we're talking here is structural rules that spending is based on a projection of your long-term or structural revenue, not just on current revenue. Colombia is moved in that direction. Peru moved in that direction. There are differences in the rule. Paraguay moved in that direction as well. I must say, for transparency, that I was advising the government of Paraguay when I was named finance minister, so I left, of course, that assignment. But they've made progress on instituting a rule and a fiscal council. We also having a rule that is deep enough, that is well established by law. Second, having a council, an independent council, having a sovereign fund. So I think those things are, I would say that's fiscal policy 2.0, and we should all aim, I hope that Latin American countries move in that direction. I was just talking to the Minister of Economy in Argentina, and he says, well, I want to do it, but not yet, because they have other problems. Some people think this is just a luxury to have this kind of rule when you have so pressing problems. I would say it's not a luxury. If you want to live better, it's better to have a rule, because otherwise, if you don't have a rule, When things go well, it's very tough to resist the pressures for increased spending if you don't have a rule. So, and this is something that we share, throughout
And
the
you've
political
communicated that to the U.S. Treasury, too.
Yes, I have communicated that to the U.S. Treasury. I met with Secretary Mnuchin, and I have offered all our humble advisory role, if we can, for them to establish a rule in this country.
Well, you've been very generous with your advice and your time, and we appreciate it very much. This was a really terrific session, and thank you, Ernesto.
Thanks you, Peter.
And thank all of you for joining us, and let's give a hand to Felipe.
Thank you.